Jonathan Roumie's hands trembled as the 5-year-old girl looked directly into his eyes and spoke words that would change everything. "I talk to Jesus all the time," little Emma said with startling clarity, "and he told me exactly where to find you tonight." The actor who had spent years portraying Christ felt his world shift as this child claimed direct communication with the Savior himself. What happened in the next hour would shake Jonathan to his core and reveal a divine plan that no one could have predicted. The little girl stood perfectly still, her wide brown eyes never leaving Jonathan's face as he processed her startling words. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper in the hushed atmosphere of St. Mary's Cathedral. She tilted her head slightly, a serene smile crossing her features. "I'm Emma," she said simply, "and Jesus said you've been asking him for a sign. He sent me to give it to you." Jonathan's mind reeled as he tried to understand how this child had appeared in the cathedral's side chapel, where he'd been praying in solitude for the past hour. The heavy wooden doors had been closed, the evening mass long concluded, and he'd specifically chosen this quiet moment to wrestle with the doubts that had been plaguing him for weeks. Yet here stood Emma, speaking with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Emma, where are your parents?" Jonathan asked, glancing around the dimly lit chapel for any sign of adults who might be looking for a missing child. The votive candles flickered softly against the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that made the moment feel almost otherworldly. Emma shook her head with remarkable composure. "They're at home. Jesus brought me here himself. He told me you needed to hear something important." 3 weeks earlier, Jonathan had been experiencing what his spiritual director called a dark night of the soul. Despite the overwhelming success of The Chosen and the countless messages from fans about how his portrayal of Jesus had changed their lives, he found himself questioning everything. The weight of playing Christ had become both a blessing and a burden that seemed too heavy to bear some days. He'd been staying late after filming, spending long hours in prayer, desperately seeking confirmation that he was worthy of this calling. The fan mail spoke of miracles and renewed faith, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was just an actor pretending to be holy. The irony wasn't lost on him. Playing Jesus while struggling with his own spiritual crisis had become his most challenging role yet. "What did Jesus tell you to say to me?" Jonathan asked Emma, his voice trembling slightly as he fully committed to this surreal conversation. The child's presence felt both impossible and undeniably real. She stepped closer, her small hands clasped behind her back in the innocent way children do when sharing a secret. "He said to tell you that your heart is exactly right for this job." The words hit Jonathan like a physical force, causing him to sit back on his heels in the pew. Those were the exact words he'd been praying to hear. Confirmation that his heart, not just his acting ability, was aligned with this sacred calling. Emma continued speaking with the simplicity that only a child could possess. "He also said that all those people who write you letters, their prayers are getting answered because of you." Jonathan felt tears welling in his eyes as Emma's words seemed to address every doubt he'd been carrying. For months, he'd wondered if he was having any real spiritual impact, or if people were just responding to good storytelling. The letters from viewers describing renewed faith, healing in families, and returns to the church had seemed too good to be true. Now this child was confirming what he'd hardly dared to hope. "How do you know Jesus, Emma?" Jonathan asked, his actor's instincts warring with a growing sense that something genuinely miraculous was happening. The cathedral around them seemed to hold its breath, the silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. Emma giggled softly, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "He comes to talk to me sometimes, usually when I'm playing in my room." The simplicity of her statement was somehow more convincing than any elaborate explanation could have been. Jonathan had studied enough theology to know that throughout history, God had often chosen to speak through children, their hearts unburdened by adult skepticism and doubt. Emma's matter-of-fact tone suggested she saw nothing unusual about having conversations with the Savior of the world. "He told me you sometimes forget that acting can be praying too," Emma continued, swinging her legs as she climbed onto the pew beside him. "When you're being Jesus on the TV show, you're really praying for all the people who watch it. That's why he picked you." Her words carried a wisdom that seemed impossible from someone who probably still believed in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Jonathan thought about his preparation process for each scene, the hours spent in prayer, the careful study of Scripture, the constant intention to honor Christ, rather than glorify himself. He'd never considered that the act of filming itself might be a form of prayer, but Emma's words rang true in his spirit. Perhaps his performance was indeed a form of worship, offered up for the souls who would witness it. "Emma, how did you get here tonight?" Jonathan asked gently, still concerned about a child wandering alone in the city. The cathedral was several miles from any residential neighborhood, and the evening air outside carried the chill of late autumn. She looked at him with the patience adults reserve for explaining obvious things to slow children. "Jesus walked with me. He wanted to make sure I found you." The impossibility of her statement should have made Jonathan dismiss her words entirely, yet something in her demeanor convinced him to keep listening. Emma's presence radiated the same peace he'd experienced during his most profound moments of prayer. She seemed completely unafraid, utterly certain of her purpose, and possessed of a joy that illuminated her entire being. If you believe God still speaks through children today, comment the words "I believe" below. As they sat together in the candlelit chapel, Jonathan found himself sharing his struggles with Emma as if she were a trusted spiritual advisor, rather than a kindergartner. He told her about the pressure of representing Jesus to millions of viewers, the weight of countless prayer requests from fans, and his fear of somehow diminishing the sacred through his human limitations. Emma listened with remarkable attention, occasionally nodding as if she understood complexities far beyond her years. When he finished speaking, she reached into her small jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "Jesus told me to give you this," she said, unfolding what appeared to be a child's drawing. "I made it for you this morning." The drawing showed two stick figures. One clearly meant to be Jesus with long hair and robes, the other labeled Jonathan in careful kindergarten letters. Between them, Emma had drawn a heart with rays emanating from it like sunshine. At the bottom, in her careful printing, she'd written, "Jesus loves Jonathan's heart." The simple artwork carried more power than any theological treatise could have managed. Jonathan stared at the drawing, overwhelmed by its innocent beauty and profound message. This child had somehow captured the very assurance he'd been desperately seeking, that his heart, imperfect as it was known and loved by Christ. The tears he'd been holding back began to flow freely as years of pressure and doubt seemed to lift from his shoulders. "He wanted me to tell you something else too," Emma said, her voice taking on a slightly more serious tone. She leaned closer to Jonathan, cupping her small hand around her mouth, as if sharing a very important secret. "He said that sometimes when you're tired and sad, you should remember that he gets tired and sad sometimes too. That's why you're so good at showing him." The profound truth in her childlike words struck Jonathan to his core. In his portrayal of Jesus, he'd always tried to show both the divine and human nature of Christ, the God who wept, who felt overwhelmed, who experienced the full range of human emotion while maintaining perfect love. Emma was confirming that his approach had been right all along. "Do you pray, Emma?" Jonathan asked, curious about the spiritual life of this remarkable child. She nodded enthusiastically, her earlier solemnity giving way to typical 5-year-old excitement. Every night before bed, and sometimes when I'm scared, and when my mom makes really good cookies. Her honest answer made Jonathan smile. Perhaps his own prayer life could benefit from such simple authenticity. As they continued talking, Jonathan learned that Emma lived with her grandmother after her parents had gone through a difficult divorce. She attended a small community church where she'd learned Bible stories and developed what she described as her friendship with Jesus. Her grandmother, she explained, had taught her that prayer was just talking to God like He was your best friend. The more Emma shared about her life, the more miraculous her presence seemed. She spoke of praying for the man who plays Jesus on TV, without knowing his name or having any way to contact him. She'd asked Jesus to help him feel better because she could tell from watching the show that he really loved God and was trying his best to tell everyone about it. My grandma says that when you really love Jesus, He sometimes gives you special jobs, Emma explained, swinging her legs from the pew. I think my special job tonight was to come tell you that you're doing really good at your special job. Her simple faith and clear sense of purpose challenged Jonathan's own complicated relationship with his calling. Jonathan realized that through Emma, he was experiencing the kind of encounter he'd portrayed countless times on screen. An ordinary moment transformed by divine intervention. The child's presence was changing him in real time, answering prayers he'd barely had the courage to voice. Her innocent certainty was restoring his own faith in ways he couldn't have imagined. "Emma, what should I do when I feel scared about playing Jesus?" Jonathan asked, genuinely seeking wisdom from this unlikely spiritual guide. She considered his question with the seriousness of a theology professor, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Just ask Him to help you remember how much He loves everyone. That's what makes you look like Him when you're acting." Her answer revealed an understanding of incarnational theology that many seminary students struggled to grasp. Emma intuitively understood that love was the key to authentically representing Christ. Not perfect knowledge or flawless performance, but genuine love for the people who would encounter Jesus through His portrayal. It was perhaps the best acting advice he'd ever received. The cathedral bells began to chime 9 o'clock, their deep bronze voices filling the sacred space with resonant beauty. Emma looked up at the sound, her expression changing to one of gentle urgency. "I think I need to go home soon," she said matter-of-factly. "Grandma will be worried, and Jesus said this visit was just supposed to be long enough for you to understand." Jonathan felt a sudden panic at the thought of Emma leaving. This encounter had already transformed his understanding of his calling and renewed his sense of purpose. He wanted to ask her 100 more questions, to somehow bottle this moment of clarity and peace. "Will I see you again?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of desperation he tried to hide. Emma smiled with the wisdom of someone far beyond her years. "Maybe," she said simply, "but you won't need to, because now you know that Jesus talks to you too. You just call it different things, like inspiration and peace, and that feeling when you know you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do." Her insight into his spiritual life was both startling and comforting. "Before you go," Jonathan said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I want to give you something." He pulled out a small wooden cross that he'd been carrying for months, a gift from a viewer who'd written about her grandmother's healing. He'd kept it as a reminder of the show's impact, but now it seemed meant for Emma. "This is for you, to remember our talk." Emma accepted the cross with reverence that seemed almost liturgical, holding it carefully in both hands as she examined its simple carved details. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I'll keep it always." She tucked it safely into her jacket pocket, patting it gently to make sure it was secure. "And I'll pray for you every night, so you don't forget what Jesus told you tonight." As they prepared to leave the chapel, Jonathan felt compelled to ask one more question. "Emma, how will you get home? I can't let you walk alone in the dark." She looked at him with that patient expression again, as if he were forgetting something obvious. "The same way I got here. Jesus will make sure I'm safe. He always takes care of me." Despite his protective instincts, Jonathan found himself believing her. Everything about this encounter had defied logical explanation, yet it felt more real and meaningful than most of his ordinary experiences. Emma's serene confidence in divine protection seemed as natural as breathing. She clearly lived in a world where miraculous care was simply expected. They walked together toward the cathedral's main entrance, their footsteps echoing softly in the vast nave. The stained glass windows, dark against the night sky, seemed to hold secrets of countless other divine encounters that had taken place within these ancient walls. Jonathan felt he was participating in a tradition stretching back centuries. Ordinary people touched by extraordinary grace. As they reached the heavy wooden doors, Emma turned to face Jonathan one final time. Her small face was illuminated by the soft light of the sanctuary lamps, giving her an almost angelic appearance. "Don't forget," she said with gentle authority, "Jesus chose you not because you're perfect, but because your heart wants to help people love him more. That's exactly what he needs." Jonathan knelt down to Emma's level, overwhelmed by gratitude for this child who had appeared like an answer to prayer. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me exactly what I needed to hear. I'll never forget this night, or what you've taught me." Emma smiled and spontaneously wrapped her arms around his neck in a quick, warm hug. "Remember to pray like we're best friends," she whispered in his ear, echoing her grandmother's wisdom. "Jesus likes it when we talk to him like that." She pulled back and looked directly into his eyes with startling intensity. "And when people write you letters about Jesus, remember that he's using your acting to answer their prayers. That's pretty special." As Jonathan stood and reached for the door handle, Emma placed her tiny hand on his arm. "One more thing," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a divine messenger. "Jesus wants you to know that he's really proud of you, not just for the show, but for being the kind of person who prays in empty churches and cares so much about doing right by him." The simple affirmation broke through the last barriers around Jonathan's heart. For months, he'd been seeking some sign that his work was meaningful, that his struggles with doubt and pressure weren't disqualifying him from this sacred calling. Through Emma, he was receiving not just reassurance, but divine approval, the very thing he'd been afraid to ask for directly. Jonathan pushed open the cathedral doors, expecting to escort Emma to wherever she needed to go. But as the cool night air rushed in, he found himself alone on the front steps. Emma had simply vanished, as silently and mysteriously as she had appeared. The street stretched empty in both directions, illuminated only by the gentle glow of streetlights and the cathedral's exterior lamps. For a moment, Jonathan wondered if he'd imagined the entire encounter. Perhaps exhaustion and stress had created an elaborate hallucination. But then he felt the crumpled drawing still clutched in his hand, its childish artwork and loving message serving as tangible proof that something extraordinary had indeed occurred. Emma's visit had been real, and its impact on his soul was undeniably genuine. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, scanning the empty street and replaying every word of their conversation. The peace that filled his heart felt like physical presence, warm and reassuring in a way he hadn't experienced in months. The doubts and fears that had driven him to the cathedral seemed to have departed with Emma, replaced by a quiet confidence in his calling. Walking slowly to his car, Jonathan found himself looking at familiar sights with new eyes. The city around him suddenly seemed filled with possibilities for divine encounters. Every person he passed potentially carrying a message from heaven, every ordinary moment pregnant with sacred potential. Emma had reminded him that God was actively involved in the world, not distant or disinterested. The drive home passed in contemplative silence as Jonathan processed the evening's events. He thought about Emma's simple faith, her absolute certainty in Jesus' love and care, her intuitive understanding of his struggles and calling. She had embodied the childlike faith that Christ himself had commended, approaching the divine with trust rather than analytical skepticism. At his apartment, Jonathan placed Emma's drawing on his bathroom mirror, where he would see it first thing each morning. The stick-figured Jesus with his loving smile would serve as a daily reminder that his portrayal of Christ was not just acting, but a form of prayer and service. The child's artistic interpretation carried more theological weight than any critical review ever could. Before bed, Jonathan knelt by his window and prayed with a freedom he hadn't felt in months. Emma's advice to talk to Jesus, like best friends, transformed his prayer from formal recitation into genuine conversation. He found himself sharing his gratitude for the evening's encounter, his renewed sense of purpose, and his amazement at how God had used a 5-year-old to restore his faith. The next morning brought a flood of emails from the show's producers about upcoming filming schedules, but Jonathan read them with fresh enthusiasm rather than familiar dread. Emma's words echoed in his mind. He was exactly right for this job. His heart was precisely what Jesus needed for this work, and his acting was actually a form of prayer for viewers around the world. During the morning's table read, fellow cast members noticed a change in Jonathan's demeanor. He approached the script with renewed reverence and joy, his performance carrying a depth and authenticity that seemed to elevate everyone around him. Director Dallas Jenkins pulled him aside afterward to comment on the powerful energy he was bringing to the scenes. "Something's different about you today," Dallas observed with characteristic directness. "Whatever happened, keep it up. You're channeling something really special." Jonathan smiled mysteriously, unable to adequately explain how a 5-year-old's midnight visit had revolutionized his understanding of his calling. Some experiences were too sacred for casual conversation. That afternoon, Jonathan received a particularly moving letter from a viewer whose teenage daughter had returned to church after watching The Chosen. Instead of his usual careful appreciation, he felt Emma's words ringing in his ears. This was Jesus using his acting to answer prayers. The letter wasn't just fan mail, it was evidence of divine work accomplished through his obedient portrayal. As filming resumed over the following weeks, Jonathan carried Emma's insights into every scene. When portraying Jesus' compassion for the outcast, he remembered her words about loving everyone. When showing Christ's human struggles, he recalled her wisdom about Jesus getting tired and sad too. The child's theological understanding informed his performance in ways that elevated the entire production. Fellow actors began commenting on the increased emotional impact of scenes involving Jonathan. His portrayal of Jesus seemed to carry new layers of authenticity and warmth. What they couldn't know was that Emma's visit had taught him to see his performance as an act of worship rather than mere entertainment, a fundamental shift that permeated every gesture and line delivery. The transformation wasn't lost on the show's fans either. Social media buzzed with observations about Jonathan's recent performances, with many noting that something had deepened in his portrayal. Viewer letters increased, describing renewed spiritual experiences and stronger connections to faith. Emma's prediction about answered prayers was manifesting in tangible ways across the global audience. 3 months after Emma's visit, Jonathan received an invitation to speak at a children's ministry conference. As he prepared his remarks about faith and calling, He found himself drawing heavily on the wisdom a 5-year-old had shared in a candlelit cathedral. Her simple insights about prayer, love, and divine friendship had become cornerstones of his own spiritual understanding. During the conference, Jonathan met dozens of children who, like Emma, possessed remarkable spiritual maturity and insight. Their honest questions and innocent observations reminded him that God often chose to reveal himself through those the world considered least likely to carry divine messages. Emma's visit had opened his eyes to the prophetic potential present in every child. 6 months later, while filming a particularly challenging scene about Jesus' relationship with children, Jonathan found himself drawing directly on his encounter with Emma. The genuine joy and wonder he brought to the interaction moved everyone on set to tears. The director called it the most authentic portrayal of Christ's love for children he'd ever witnessed on film. As the scene wrapped, Jonathan touched the wooden cross Emma had given him, which he now wore on a chain beneath his costume. Her gift had become his most treasured possession, not because of its material value, but because it represented a divine encounter that had forever changed his understanding of faith, calling, and the miraculous presence of God in ordinary moments. The show's impact continued to expand globally, with translations reaching countries where Christianity faced persecution. Letters arrived from underground churches describing how Jonathan's portrayal had strengthened believers facing difficult circumstances. Emma's words about answered prayers proved prophetic as faith communities worldwide drew strength from his performance. Jonathan began keeping a journal of viewer testimonies, documenting the spiritual transformations people attributed to watching The Chosen. Each entry confirmed Emma's insight that his acting was indeed a form of prayer, creating space for divine encounters in living rooms, church fellowship halls, and hearts around the world. The ripple effects of that midnight conversation continued expanding. On quiet evenings, Jonathan often returned to St. Mary's Cathedral, sitting in the same pew where Emma had shared her divine message. He would pray for her safety and thank God for sending such an extraordinary messenger. The chapel had become sacred space, a place where heaven had touched earth through the faith of a child who believed in miracles. A year after their encounter, Jonathan received a Christmas card addressed in careful kindergarten handwriting. Inside, Emma had drawn another picture, this time showing Jesus watching The Chosen on television with a big smile. Her note read, "He still thinks you're doing a really good job. Love, Emma." The card confirmed that their connection transcended that single night. The card's postmark revealed it had been sent from a small town 3 states away, confirming that Emma's presence at the cathedral had indeed been miraculous. Jonathan had long suspected that her appearance couldn't be explained by ordinary means, but the postmark provided tangible evidence that God had orchestrated something supernatural to answer his desperate prayers for affirmation. As The Chosen prepared for its final season, Jonathan approached each remaining scene with the reverence of someone who understood he was participating in divine work. Emma's words had transformed his perspective from actor portraying a character to servant facilitating encounters between viewers and the living Christ. Every line delivery became an opportunity for prayer. The show's finale required Jonathan to portray the crucifixion and resurrection, scenes he had once dreaded as impossible to approach worthily. But Emma's wisdom about love being the key to authentic representation gave him courage. He prepared through prayer, asking Jesus to use his human limitations to somehow point toward divine love and sacrifice. During filming of the resurrection scene, something extraordinary happened. As Jonathan emerged from the tomb, still in character as the risen Christ, he felt a familiar presence, the same peace that had surrounded Emma's visit a year earlier. In that moment, he understood that his portrayal had become transparent to divine reality, allowing Christ himself to reach through the performance. The crew fell silent as they witnessed something beyond acting, a moment where performance became proclamation, where entertainment transcended into worship. Several team members later described feeling they had encountered the living Jesus through Jonathan's portrayal. Emma's prophecy about answered prayers was fulfilled in ways none of them could have anticipated or orchestrated through human effort alone. When the final scene wrapped and cameras stopped rolling, Jonathan remained kneeling in the garden set, overwhelmed by what had just occurred. The director approached cautiously, recognizing that something sacred had taken place. "That wasn't just acting," Dallas whispered. "That was something else entirely." Jonathan nodded, tears streaming down his face as he realized the full scope of what Emma had predicted. His heart was exactly right for this job. In that moment of completion, Jonathan heard a familiar voice calling his name. He turned to see Emma standing at the edge of the set, no longer 5 but now 6 years old, wearing a white dress and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. She smiled with the same radiant joy he remembered, her presence once again filling the space with inexplicable peace. "Jesus wanted me to come see your last day," Emma said simply, walking toward him with the same supernatural confidence she'd displayed in the cathedral. "He's really happy with how everything turned out." The cast and crew watched in stunned silence as this child appeared without explanation, speaking with authority that seemed to emanate from beyond her years. Emma handed Jonathan the wildflowers, their simple beauty somehow perfect for this moment of completion. "These are from the garden where he prayed before everything happened," she explained matter-of-factly. "He picked them himself and asked me to give them to you as a thank-you present for helping so many people meet him properly." Jonathan accepted the flowers with trembling hands, understanding that he was receiving not just a gift, but a divine commendation for work completed faithfully. Emma's presence confirmed that his portrayal had accomplished its intended purpose, not to showcase his acting ability, but to create windows through which people could encounter the living Christ with renewed faith and love. "You did exactly what he hoped you would do," Emma continued, her voice carrying the weight of divine approval. "All those people who watched and cried and prayed and came back to church. That was the plan all along. He just needed someone with a heart like yours to help make it happen." Her words validated every moment of doubt, every prayer for guidance, every choice to prioritize faithfulness over fame. As the crew gathered around them, Emma turned to address the entire group with remarkable composure. "Jesus wants everyone to know that this show was his idea from the beginning," she announced. "He's been working through all of you to help people remember how much they're loved. That's why everything turned out so beautiful and touched so many hearts around the world." The revelation that their work had been divinely orchestrated from its inception left everyone speechless. What they had experienced as creative collaboration and professional dedication was revealed to be participation in a divine plan spanning years and touching millions of lives. Emma's simple proclamation reframed their entire understanding of the project's true significance and eternal impact. "Now you get to rest and be proud of what you all did together," Emma told them, with maternal warmth that seemed impossible from someone so young. "But this isn't really the end, because Jesus is going to keep using this show to help people for a really long time. Every time someone new watches it, he'll be there with them, just like he was here with you while you were making it." Jonathan knelt down to Emma's level one final time, his heart overflowing with gratitude for this child who had appeared at his darkest moment and restored his faith in his calling. "Thank you, Emma," he whispered, "for everything, for showing me that Jesus was with us all along. She smiled and touched the cross pendant around his neck, the same gesture that had begun their relationship over a year ago. "He never left," Emma replied with absolute certainty. "He was just waiting for you to stop worrying and start trusting. That's when the really good stuff could happen." She leaned forward and whispered in his ear, "And guess what? He has more special jobs for you, because people need to keep learning about his love. But don't worry about those yet. Just enjoy finishing this one perfectly." As Emma stepped back from their embrace, she began to glow with the same soft light that had illuminated her in the cathedral, a radiance that seemed to emanate from within her small frame. "I have to go back now," she said peacefully, "but I'll keep praying for you every night like I promised. And remember, whenever you miss Jesus, just look at all the letters from people whose lives got changed. That's him saying hello." The crew watched in awe as Emma's form gradually became translucent, her smile never fading as she slowly dissolved into particles of light that danced briefly in the air before disappearing entirely. The wildflowers remained in Jonathan's hands, their fresh fragrance filling the space where she had stood, providing tangible proof that their encounter with the divine messenger had been gloriously real. In the silence that followed Emma's departure, Jonathan felt the same profound peace that had sustained him throughout the entire project. The doubts and fears that had once plagued him were permanently replaced by unshakable confidence in God's plan and provision. The child's visits had bookended his portrayal of Christ with divine affirmation and supernatural encouragement. Dallas Jenkins was the first to speak, his voice hushed with reverence. "I don't know what we just witnessed, but I know it was sacred," he said, looking at the spot where Emma had vanished. "This project has been blessed from the beginning in ways we never understood." The entire cast and crew nodded in agreement, united by their shared experience of the miraculous. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave the set for the final time, each person carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something far greater than entertainment. Emma's appearances had revealed the true nature of their work, a divine collaboration designed to draw hearts back to Christ through the power of authentic storytelling and supernatural grace. 6 months later, The Chosen had been viewed by over 500 million people worldwide, with countless testimonies of renewed faith, healed relationships, and life-changing encounters with Christ. Jonathan kept every letter in a special filing cabinet, Emma's words echoing in his mind each time he read about another person whose spiritual journey had been transformed by watching the show. The wildflowers Emma had given him on the final day of filming had been pressed and framed, hanging in Jonathan's home office as a reminder that his work continued to bear fruit in ways he might never fully understand. Each morning, he would pause before the frame and thank God for sending a child to restore his faith and remind him of the eternal significance of his calling. During interviews about the show's impact, Jonathan would often mention the importance of childlike faith and remaining open to divine encounters in unexpected places. He never revealed the specific details of Emma's visits, understanding that some experiences were too sacred for public consumption, but her influence permeated his perspective on faith, calling, and the miraculous presence of God in ordinary life. The wooden cross Emma had given him became a symbol of his transformed understanding of his vocation. No longer did he see acting as separate from ministry. Instead, he understood performance as a form of prayer and service when offered with pure intention. Her wisdom had bridged the gap between art and worship, showing him that God could use any willing heart to accomplish divine purposes. As Jonathan continued his career, he carried Emma's lessons into every project, every interview, and every fan encounter. Her simple faith had taught him to see his work as collaboration with divine love, his struggles as opportunities for spiritual growth, and his platform as a tool for pointing hearts toward heaven, rather than drawing attention to himself. The story of Jonathan Roumie and the little girl who talked with Jesus reminds us that God still speaks through the most unexpected messengers, often using the faith of children to restore hope in weary adults. When we remain open to divine encounters and willing to listen to unconventional sources of wisdom, we might discover that heaven is much closer than we imagined, reaching toward us through the innocence and trust of those who believe without reservation that Jesus keeps his promises to never leave us alone. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more inspiring testimonies of faith, and share in the comments below. Have you ever experienced an unexpected encounter that strengthened your faith or changed your perspective on God's presence in your life?